Now let's go ahead and do the same thing we did here programmatically. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this. And remember, we are inside of our activity main here. So what I'm going to do, let me close that one down, and this one, we're just going to change it all. So now this is going to be frame layout. I'm going to make this a frame layout as such. Remember, a frame layout, all it does, it just allows us to the frame layout as such. So a frame layout will allow us to put one single object inside of our screen. Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing here. I'm going to get rid of this. Okay, and this is wrong. This has to be there. Okay, and while we're here, let's go ahead and actually give an ID. I'm going to say ID. I'm going to give an Android ID. In this case, I'm just going to call this my container. But this is what we're going to be using to reference our frame layout in code. So we'll go back to, now let's go back to our main activity here. This is where we're going to programmatically fetch our fragment and display it inside of our screen. Okay, because that's the whole idea. Fragments are pieces of user interface that we can actually use inside of our activities. To do that, we are going to use a fragment manager. Okay, fragment manager is a class that allows us to manage our fragments. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say fragment manager. There it is at the bottom, and we're going to use the support one again because we want to make sure that that older version of Android will be able to also run this. Okay, so I'm going to say fragment manager. I'm going to call this fragment manager such. I'm going to say is equal to get support fragment manager. Okay, as such. So we have that object, and then I'm going to create a fragment here. Again, it's going to be support fragment always. I'm going to call this fragment. I'm going to say is equal to fragment manager dot, and then I'm going to say find fragment by ID, just the first option there. Okay, so now what we're going to do, I'm going to say r.id dot my container as such. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to put an if statement here. I'm going to say if our fragment is indeed null. Okay. If that's true, then that means we have to actually create a new fragment. So I'm going to say fragment is equal to new. I'm going to say main fragment as such. Now this main fragment here is actually creating a new fragment by calling our main fragment constructor here. It knows everything about constructing our fragment view here. Okay, that's all we're doing here. Okay, so now that once that is done, what we're going to do, we're going to just call our fragment manager again because it knows everything, what to do things, and we're going to begin the begin transaction. What we're going to do is we are beginning to create our container, our fragment. Okay, so say fragment manager, go ahead and start creating everything that it needs to be created in order for us to then host this fragment here. So I'm going to do begin transaction, enter, dot. I'm going to add the fragment. Notice our IDE helps us a lot because it knows exactly what next step should be. For add fragment here, we're going to use to add obviously the r.id to my container. I'm going to pass my container because that is the fragment we're getting. And then I'm going to pass the fragment. Here's the container, which if you remember correctly is going to be, let's go back to here, this container here. So we're saying now whatever we are getting from our fragment, which we go back to main fragment, which is going to be this fragment main layout, which is going to be this, we want to put it inside of our container. Okay, this is not over yet. It's a complex statement, and I'm going to make sure that I commit. Commit means that everything is set up, so we're saying yes to the system. Go ahead and create our fragment here. Okay, now if we save this and give it a run, you will see that we should see our fragment. There we go. Hello from fragment. So essentially it's the same thing that we did earlier, but now we're doing it all programmatically using Java code, which is the best way of doing it because now we have a lot of more flexibility on how to do things. Okay, let's go over once again here. So what are we doing here? We created the fragment manager because we need that manager that will allow us to manage our fragment per se. Okay, we are using the get support manager, so we instantiate our fragment manager, and then we're creating an instance of our fragment. We are getting that from our fragment manager because we're using our fragment manager to inflate or to get our container ID. Right, so pointing to our, go back here, this container here. We're saying, hey, get us the container where we're going to put this fragment. Okay, that's what's happening here. And then here I'm going to say, well, if fragment is null, once the application starts, it's going to be null, which means then we're going to go ahead and create a new fragment here. Now, this new fragment object that we are creating here, we are calling the main fragment constructor, which knows all about creating a fragment, which is going to be this fragment here. So when the onCreate is called, then we're going to go ahead and inflate our fragment main, which is this fragment XML that we created, and put that in our container. So once that is done, then we call back our fragment manager and we say, hey, let's start the transaction. We pass in the container, of course, our .id.container, that's the ID of our container, as in this frame layout here inside of our activity main XML. And then we pass the fragment because we need that object fragment which has the view from our fragment. And then we say commit, which means says we're all set, we understand everything is good, just commit to all the changes, save everything, and show me what needs to be shown. And voila, we have our hello from fragment. Notice again, just to make sure, so now we are pulling this fragment or this text view here from our fragment and we're putting it inside of our activity, or rather inside of our activity here. Okay, so the flexibility here is the following. We could create as many layouts, fragment layout as we want, and in code we can call any fragment that we create inside of our layout in runtime, and that would instantly pull those fragments and put those in our activity.